So next speaker is Raffaele Marchetti from Luis University in Italy, the backlash against global integrations beyond populism. And that seems to be also very interesting. Raffaele, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, Jeff, for organizing this and for inviting me. I mean, it's a pleasure. My contribution to this debate can be summarized in 3 points. First of all, populism, who is at the center of our political debates, is relevant, but perhaps not so heuristically important in order to understand what is the real core of the debate today. Second point, in order to understand the political debate, we should really look at another kind of dichotomy, which is not populism or anti-populism, but rather the kind of attitudes that different political positions hold vis-à-vis the idea of supranational integration or more localist positions. And third point, which I will develop to conclude my presentation, I would hold that we are witnessing a shift into the debate, and the kind of macro narratives which were dominating in the 90s and the beginning of 2000s are now sliding into a position of being more criticized or perhaps questioned and perhaps challenged by other positions, including a civilizational-based position. So, and in that sense, in a way, I mean, the conclusion of this paper would be to hold that the civilization approach is still relevant, perhaps even more relevant than in the past. We talk about populism every time, everywhere, in the EU, in the US. We identify the populism as the critical factors that is leading to the decline of the West, who is dismantling and putting into crisis the world as we have known it for many decades. At the European EU level, in many European countries, there is this idea that populism, sometimes sort of facilitated by media, this anti-establishment, anti-caste attitude is sort of pushing up a strong destabilization of the traditional electoral system and bringing to power positions that are extreme, that are sort of at odds with the traditional understanding of political sort of ideologies, and hence this is putting at risk many things, many institutions, the EU itself, even sometimes democracy. So, I mean, it's populism really is there. I mean, it's a central concern. Now, I do think that, of course, populism is an important concept, and we should be worried to some extent. But I do think it is unconvincing if we focus only on populism. I would argue that in order to understand some of the more fundamental issues that underpins the populist positions in Europe, in the US, but also in other countries, we might talk about Turkey, perhaps Israel and others, we need to look at a different dichotomy, that is this dichotomy between an attitude that is favorable in support of further supranational integration in political, in cultural, in social, in economic terms, and those who resist this. It is very clear that many of the protest movements and protest parties that we see now so prominent in many Western countries, and we just need to wait for the next European election next year to see perhaps a very different also European Parliament, has to do with the backlash, the kind of reaction to the economic crisis that has hit Europe in the last few years. There is this famous graph by Branko Milanovic, the elephant graph, about the winners and losers of globalizations, and you have this peak, which would be the back of the elephant, which are the middle class in the emerging economies in India and China, who have seen their sort of quality of life and positioning into the society improved. And then you have the neck that is going down, that is the middle class in the developed countries, who have seen their economic performances and economic status deteriorated because of globalization. And then you have the nose of the elephant, that is the super rich, who have been increasing their status thanks to globalization. Now it's this middle class in the developed countries who are protesting because in objective economic terms their positioning is worse than earlier, and they are protesting very often relying on the kinds of parties that we were discussing earlier on. Now, I would argue that one of the central issues here is their contestation of globalization. I mean, they attribute the deterioration of their economic status to the global integration, to the delocalization of multinational corporations, to the buying out by foreign companies, through free trade, to a number of economic issues, economic elements and dynamics that are typical of globalization. And in a way, the supporters of those kinds of measures are considered a kind of responsible for such situation. So these are typical the center-left, center-right parties in Europe. We see everywhere grand coalition in Germany, at the European Union, in many other countries. People's Party, Socialist Party joined together, still supporting this idea that supranational integration, European integration, Europeanization is a positive thing, both in economic terms and in political terms. But of course, against this, we see more and more in every country a strong backlash. And perhaps Italy is the most evident case in point. Of course, the first case was Greece, but then a government who seemed to be very alternative to mainstream understanding of European integration was quite quickly sort of reintegrated, I would say. So at the moment really is Italy the challenger, with a government who is openly critical toward European integration, critical to global integration. They've just got in power, so we don't know what will happen. But I think it's very important, because Italy being an important country in the EU, I think it's a very illustrative case in point of how the dynamics are changing. Of course, at the macro level, I mean, the election of Trump in the US was obviously at the global level much more significant. This protest, these sort of protest movements are strongly embedded in the idea, in a contextualist idea of politics that might be localist, might be more civilizationist, but the idea is anyway that this kind of universal integration is no good because it generates economic problems and deletes identities. So it's bad both on the welfare dimension and on the identity dimension. So welfare and identity both are damaged by this kind of global integration from this perspective. So it is to this debate, I think, that we need to look at in order to understand what's going on. And of course, there is a parallel debate in the EU European enthusiasts, critical, skeptical. I mean, this is, I think, I see a very strong parallelism between the two debates. So there were two positions who were dominant in the 90s and the early 2000s. And obviously, the most dominant one was the neoliberal position. I don't want to spend much time on this, but it's clearly the idea that the world is going and should be going toward a further integration. A global single market, we are all global consumers, as well as potentially global entrepreneurs. There should be no boundaries, no sort of limits and constraints to economic activities, because this generates a better off a market that delivers good at the most effective pace. This idea was very important, was actually one of the idea underpinning also the European economic integration as a European market, not exclusively, but it was an important idea. Associated to this is the idea that the more you integrate economically, of course, the less conflictual you are going to be, more peace will come. A traditional liberal idea from Kant onward. Associated to this is also the idea that politics is not really so important, that technocracy might well deliver a better job, a better performance than politics. You need only good technocrats, people who know to manage society rather than politically run society in order to deliver the goods, the expected goods. Typical, again, I look at Italy. When there is a crisis in Italy, politicians are thrown out of the scheme and managers, technocrats are put in, a technocratic government, because that's the government, the only government that can solve the crisis. So neoliberalism was dominant, but also important, significant has been for many years the more politically oriented dimension of this pro-integration position, which is the position of cosmopolitanism, where citizens are included into a global system, yes, with some diversification, but it's the idea of universal human rights, the idea that passports are not so important because ultimately we are entitled to rights and entitlements that are universal. So these were the two dominant paradigms, but I would say that in the 90s and in the beginning of the 20th century, I mean, these were challenged, but from a minority point of view, from the two positions which were critical of this pro or globalist position, if you want. On the one hand, the localist position, the idea that, well, no, politics is not global. Politics needs to be vernacular. That politics needs to be participatory. Politics need to be local, embedded into participatory practices. There shouldn't be, I mean, a sort of global international organization, but really politics can only be deliberate and conducted in first person. And that's the kind of thing. And not only politics, but also the economy. This idea of local production, local consumption, the idea that cultures are embedded into a specific context that needs to remain embedded, otherwise they are going to lose their identity, their genuinity. This was a significant alternative for many years, but of course never managed to become hegemonic. And then there was the civilizational debate, already from the 90s, and the more clash declination or more the dialogic declination. But again, the idea that, well, no, actually, universality, it might be considered a threat insofar as damage the differentiation of cultures and identities, and in a way, it's inherently non-pluralistic and non-based on the idea of heterogeneity. And so we really rather need to sort of preserve the differences, because this is where the richness of global society really comes from. Now, what is interesting, if we look at this debate, which was quite consolidated, I mean, for more than almost 3 decades, is those who were dominating neoliberalism and cosmopolitanism seems today in a phase of decline, in a phase of at least contestation in many political systems, in also many political debates. Localism was earlier on relevant, but now a bit less, but civilizational, who was marginal in the 90s, I mean, despite Huntington, but really the policy paradigm was very far from being rooted in the civilizational perspective, perhaps now is becoming it's getting more central to the political debate. So from my perspective, it's interesting because you see, I mean, the points of reference who were there in the debate in the 90s remain there, but there is a very significant shift into the political debates, which, of course, to some extent has consequences also in the actual politics, in the electoral politics, but more significantly or profoundly, if you want, as a shift in the master frames, in the political models, in the ideals to which we refer when we create political projects, political visions, and in a way, sort of images of society. And so today we are in a situation which is very significant and to some extent also very ironic, because in the 90s, yes, of course, I mean, Huntington was very much discussed, but in actual political debate, the civilizational position was very marginalized, and it seems to me that through the irony of history is getting back very much at the center of the debates, and that is where we are today. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Raffaele. Thank you for sticking to the time, but in particular for your very interesting presentation in the debate, which has, in my view, just started and will last the next years, if not the next decades. The controversy between globalization, integration, and national, regional, local identity. And following your presentation, I would say the solution is as much globalization as it's possible, but as much local, regional, national politics is needed by the people to stick to their identity. So thank you very much, and we have to continue this debate.